Mike Swope here at Indiana. We're here at the Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio Regional Council of Carpenters Apprenticeship Training Facility, Newburgh, Indiana. And today I'm going to do a demonstration for the guys on the safe use of oxy-fuel cutting systems. And the reason we call it oxy-fuel is because there can be several different types of gases we use with oxygen when we're cutting, or also welding with it. So you have to pay attention to what type of gas you're using. So we're going to talk about the first things you need to keep in mind is what you need, and you need compressed gases to do this with. So how do we know what type of gas is in these tanks? You got an idea?
It's labeled on them.
It's labeled on them, okay? You cannot go by the color of the tank. This tank could be purple, pink, yellow, blue, it doesn't matter. This one is green, but we see right here it's compressed oxygen. So it has to have that legible label on there for us to know what we're using. And this tank here is acetylene. And like I said, you can use different types of fuels for this. You can use MAP gas, propylene, propane. Depending on what type of gas you're using, you may have to change your hoses and your torch tip setups for the type of gas that you're using. Okay? So storage on these, OSHA regulates that anytime you're storing bottles like this, you have to keep them separated. Right? So at least a 20-foot in between them, or you can have a barrier wall with a 5-hour fire protection on it. So either way, when you're using what you've got set up to use, it's okay to have them beside each other as long as they're secured in your cart, okay? Or if there's freestanding, they have to be secured with a rope, a wire, or chain, something like that to hold them up. Anytime you're going to move these, you need to have the caps in place and take the regulators and everything off so you can have the caps in place. Now, sometimes these caps on these tanks will get froze up on there a little bit. One thing you don't ever want to do, especially with oxygen, you never want to oil that, okay? So these caps are made where they have these slots in there. You may have to stick a wrench or something like that in there to get them off. But you never want to put oil on there, because if oxygen and oil mix, it can make a very rapid, fierce combustion. Okay, so we remove our caps both our tanks. And one of the things you want to look at is to make sure these threads here are not damaged on either one of your tanks. And what you want to do is what we call cracking the bottle. Okay, so we crack it open so if there's any kind of foreign material in here, it's going to blow it out. Just a quick crack like that, the same for your gas. So that clears any kind of substance that may be in them valves out of there. It's very important you do that. So once we've done that, we have to put regulators on the bottles. And depending on which type of bottle you have, the regulators will be different for them. This one here is our oxygen regulator. On this side, it shows how many pounds is going to be in the bottle. Okay, usually when a full bottle comes in, it's going to have about 2,500 pounds of pressure in it. Then this here is our working pressure, okay? This here is what we adjust our working pressure, or how much is going to come through out into our torch system with this here. So, put this on here. And these are brass fittings, so you never want to really torque them down tight or anything like that. You just want to snug them up. That right there. Okay. Turn that around to where we can see where the gauges are at on it. Same thing with your fuel. Say we're using acetylene today. Now you can tell one main difference about these gauges on your oxygen working pressure. You can go up, sometimes we run it at 80 or 100 pounds of pressure for that. Generally, for most cutting, you're going to run it around 40 pounds of working pressure. Okay, now on your acetylene, you can see where it's got a red line at 15 psi. You never want to go above that. Acetylene becomes very unstable with a working pressure above 15 psi. So make sure you got the proper gauge on there. And I think I got this on here too tight. So you actually have to put an adapter on here. You're going to bring different types of bottles in. The threads may be different. But one thing to remember, these are always left-hand threads on your fuel. Okay? So we actually got an adapter on this one. So it'll fit our bottle. Just loosen it up enough where I can screw it in the tank here. Okay, so it should screw in real nice. You can tell there's nothing wrong with the threads. And then again, we just want to snug this up because we don't want to strip in brass threads out of there. Take a wrench and snug it up. Now, it's real important that whatever you're hooking these tanks up with, you keep the wrench close by. Okay? There's also an all-purpose fuel gas wrench, and sometimes these tanks will come in, they'll have just a square notch up here for the valve. That's what that's for. You place it on there and shut that on and off with. And then it's got all the different size of hose fittings or gauge fittings that you would need. Okay. So one of the main things you want to do when you're putting these gauges on before you ever turn your tanks on is make sure that these regulators are backed out all the way. Okay, what happens if there's any foreign material or anything that gets in them, as soon as that pressure hits it when you open them up, it can cause them to blow up, and they have been known to explode. So you want to be careful about that, and that's something that really gets overlooked out on your job sites, is nobody backs them off when they're done with them. You want to make sure you do that. Okay, so we got our gauges on there. Next thing we got is another safety device, and these are called flashback arresters, okay? We have one for our oxygen, one for our acetylene. And the purpose of these, if we have any kind of a backflash or any type of a fire that gets into our hose, these have a centered filter in them, and it'll stop them sparks from going up into our tanks and causing them to explode. So you always want to make sure, this is another OSHA regulation, that you have these in place. Now, we're going to put them here at our gauges, and you got to pay attention. They have arrows on them for which way the gas is going to flow. Okay, and this one here should go on here just like this. Whoops, that one, the red one. Again, it's left-handed threads. There's no way I could get it on my oxygen regulator by mistake. On our oxygen. Now they may have you put these on at your torch fitting too. Our torches actually got them built in, so some torches will have them and some won't. So if they don't have them, you may want to put them on your torch, so if anything gets back to that point, it'll stop it there, not get down through your hoses. But it is an OSHA regulation that them are in line at one point. Snug him up just a little bit. Tighter there. There we go. Okay. Now once we have them on there, then we can hook our hoses up. Now, how do we know, what do we know about our hoses here? Have a green one and a red one, right? So that lets you know the green is always going to be your oxygen, and the red is going to be for your fuel gas. Now, if you're running propylene, propane, something like that, you do have to pay attention. You can run acetylene through a propylene or propane hose, but you cannot run let's see, I may have said that backwards. You can run acetylene through both types of hoses, but you can't run propylene through just an acetylene hose. So you have to make sure that the letters match up. So since we're using acetylene, we know that we're good here. So same thing on this. They do have reverse threads on them, just like on the gauges. There's reverse threads, so you cannot hook them up backwards or to the wrong bottles. Okay. So once we get them snugged up with my wrench, The next thing we want to do is purge our lines, okay? And purging the lines, that gets any kind of foreign material that may be in them hoses out of there before we hook it up to our torch, which could plug our torch up. Okay, so what I'm going to do, anytime you're turning these on, you always want to stand off to the side of your regulator. If I'm standing here in front of it, if it does blow for some reason, it's going to come out this way. So always stand off to the side of it and very slowly crack that bottle open. Real slow. And we've seen our pressure jump up on our gauge there. Now, since we're just purging the line, I'll put some pressure on there and we can hear it start coming out. Okay, I'll shut my bottle off, back off. Same thing on our fuel. Stand off to the side, slowly crack it open. We've seen our working pressure go up. Put some pressure on our our tank pressure. Now our working line, we're turning it up. We've got that line purged. Okay, so one thing you want to keep in mind when you're ready to turn these on, our oxygen bottle will always turn it on all the way. It's got a double seated valve in there, so it's either all the way open or all the way shut. So you always open this one up all the way, but on our acetylene, we just want to crack that open about a quarter to a half a turn. And the main reason for that is if you have to get to it to shut it off quick, you can. And there's a different type of valve there too. It's not double seated like your oxygen, so it only needs a quarter or a half a turn to have full pressure on it. Okay, so once we got all that system hooked up, now we're going to decide what kind of process we're going to do. Okay, so you can do welding, heating, cutting, whatever you want to do with this system. With this here, this is just a cutting torch, okay? And the tips in it, depending on what size tip you're going to use, it's going to give you a finer cut, and the thickness of material you can actually cut is going to increase. So you can change these tips out. They usually start off at a 0 and they go up to a 5 or a 6. And that middle hole where the oxygen comes out will be bigger as the number increases. So sometimes that gets dirty, and we use these tip cleaners. It's just small files to clean them hose out in there if it does get dirty. Okay. But you can also have this type of attachment that goes on here, and this is what we're going to hook up today. Okay, so this is my torch body. All right, we have a fuel side. And we have our oxygen side, just like on the gauges that were hooked up. So once we hook them up, depending on what we're going to do with our torch, is going to depend on the type of head we put on it. Okay. One other thing about the hoses, this is going to be a real strong wear point right here. And you always want to inspect all your hoses before you actually start working with them. Okay, so I got my torch body hooked up. Now, depending on which one of these heads I put on there, this head here is just for oxyacetylene welding. Okay, so it's just going to put out a small flame where we can melt metals together. And there's different sizes of those, depending on what thickness of metal you wear. This head here is called a rosebud, and it'll put out a real strong flame for heating metal up. You can heat metal up to bend it or to deform it or whatever you need to do with it. And then this, of course, is our cutting head. So any of those heads just screw on there, and then they don't have to be real tight either. You just want to snug it up with your wrench. Okay. Now for our cutting head, this oxygen valve down here will always be turned all the way on. Okay, so that lets the oxygen come up to this valve here. And this valve is going to be the one that shuts your oxygen on and off. Okay, now on your fuel, this is the only valve for the fuel. So once you turn that on, it's going to have fuel up to it. Once we've got that hooked up, we want to get our tanks turned on and purge our lines. So same system, stand off to the side, slowly turn it on. We're seeing our pressure come up on our tank. Go ahead and turn this one all the way on. And then I'm going to set our working pressure for about 40 psi. So I'm slowly turning that up. Now it's going to vary with what type of gas you're using with it or what thickness of material you're cutting. If you're using a rosebud, you're going to want it cranked up higher. So that'll all vary. Same thing on our fuel over here. We're settling, turning on real slow. Then I go about a quarter to a half a turn. And I'm only going to turn it up to about 5 psi. Depending on what you're cutting, about 5 psi. If you're using a MAP gas or something like that, you'll probably run it around 10 or so. Alright, so now one of the other considerations you have to really take into effect when you're going to use this system is your area that you're going to be working in for number one. We don't want anything around that's going to combust. Okay, any kind of wood, any kind of solvents that may be around, anything that could catch on fire. You want to have a fire extinguisher close available. We have one right there that's within 10 feet of us, so we know where the fire extinguisher's at. Make sure you assess your area, make sure there's nothing that's going to go wrong. So then you come into your personal protective equipment. What do we need to keep ourselves safe? Of course, you need a jacket to protect your arms, your clothing underneath, because you're going to be dealing with a lot of hot molten metal when you use this system. And you don't want to have any clothes that's got any kind of frays on them or anything like that, because it will catch on fire quick. Okay, you button these up, you always want to button them all the way to the top so it protects anything from getting down inside you. A good pair of heavy leather gloves. This will get very hot, like I said. Welding gloves are sufficient. You want to make sure they're nice, insulated, heavy gloves. Now, OSHA says for our eye protection, you are dealing with some ultraviolet rays here, and about a shade 3 to a shade 8 is what you would use for cutting or welding with an oxy-fuel. But they do not specify whether it has to be goggles, glasses, or a full face shield. So any of them are acceptable according to OSHA. If you're wearing the goggles, you have to have safety glasses, just clear safety glasses underneath them. Okay, it's the same if you're wearing a shield. And I really prefer the shield over anything else because it protects your face. If we're wearing just these goggles, this stuff will backfire and pop, and it's going to burn you when it does. So if you have a full face shield on, or if you have one that you can wear, that's the best thing to use. Another thing you want to have is some good earplugs. And this is just not for just the noise, but these hot sparks can get down in your ear canal. And when they do, it's going to hurt you. It's going to burn you bad. So you want to make sure you got some earplugs in anytime you're welding or cutting. Okay, so last thing I'm going to do is just give you an example of lighting the torch up and show you what the flame should look like once you've got it set and ready to cut with. So I get my gloves on. Make sure I've got my safety glasses on. Okay, anytime you're lighting a torch, you do not want to use matches or a lighter or anything like that. This striking device right here, it's got a flint in there, and when we squeeze it together, it produces sparks. That's what you want to light it with. Okay, so like I said, this oxygen is on, so this is our oxygen control now on this. This is our fuel side. So when I'm lighting this torch, I'm just going to crack this fuel open and just barely crack my oxygen open. When I light that flame, it's not going to be set perfectly, but if you just light it with just the fuel on, you're going to have a bunch of black soot burning off. So if you turn your fuel, I'm sorry, I don't have enough pressure on there, but turn it up just a little bit more. There, I hear it. Okay, so just turn your fuel on a little bit, just barely crack your oxygen on. Now we should be able to light this. Okay. So there we've got, right there is what you would call a carburizing flame. There's not enough oxygen mixed with the fuel. So I'm turning my oxygen up, and what you're looking for is a nice crown in that tip. Once I get that, I squeeze my cutting pressure, and I reset that where I just got a crown there. okay? So that first flame you've got is your preheat flame. And that's what you want to use to preheat your metal with, to get it hot enough to cut. And once you've got it hot enough, then you hit your cutting pressure, and that's what blows the molten metal away. So we'll stop there and we'll let everybody get suited up, and we will let everybody have a chance to try to cut some metal with it. Thank you very much, and let's go to the next part.